All right, welcome to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. I'm Deremy Dove. I'm joined by my tag team partner, the man, the myth, the legend, the hardest working man in show business, Mr. Jose Ruiz. What's going on, man?
What's going on, Deremy, man? I always feel funny when we have someone on and you say that because it's like not true, but it
I'm not
sounds
going to
really
change.
It
good.
sounded really good.
It
Like, I'm
sounds great.
impressed.
Yeah,
I can't change, man. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to get all sedity with it just because the guest is here. I mean, I'm honored that the guest is here, but I got to keep it
absolutely.
real.
Love it.
So it's been fun because our last episode was a rewatch of that epic Monday night game, in 85, the Bears 12-0 going into the Orange Bowl to play the Dolphins, and Marino and Shula said, "Nah, you're not going to
Nah,
17-0. No, you ain't doing that." But it was awesome because having our guest who, knows so much about the Dolphins history, talk to us about it and all. It was like you and I were talking like, hey, we got to have him on the show. So someone who hosts an awesome podcast I've been listening to for years, The Fish Tank with OJ McDuffie. He's worked with the Dolphins. He works with Jason Taylor's foundation. We're honored to have Seth Levit joining us. So Seth, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you guys for having me. And like we were saying before we pressed record here, thanks for caring about things that happened before your time. I think we live in this generation of now, and not to sound like the old crusty guy, but and now is cool, but that doesn't mean that what happened before doesn't matter. So I think it's really neat what you guys are doing.
no, absolutely. And I just think what we love to do here, Bigger Than the Game, Seth, it's we try to connect the past to the present, right? Like that's kind of like our thing here. And
Yeah.
we're big sports historians, not even just NFL, but just sports overall. But NFL is something that a lot of people care about, obviously, and we love to look back and dive into, why this game is so great today. It's because of players that we're going to talk about in today's episode, and teams and coaches. So, yeah, we appreciate that, and we love to kind of dive in with other people too who love the sport as
We
well.
love to dive in the fish tank as well, man. So you're speaking my language. That's good
There
stuff.
you go.
No, absolutely. You guys have so many great episodes with so many great players in Dolphins history. It's a great listen for anyone who loves, football history. But I want to get into your history a little bit too, Seth,
man.
because
Ancient history.
and I've heard it on the podcast, but you starting in 1996 as a young intern with the Dolphins
Yeah.
is so pivotal because we're also, even though we have Philly roots, we're fascinated by Jimmy Johnson and
Yes.
just
Oh man.
the coach, the madness, the method, how he really changed the game. So how was that for you coming into the Dolphins and Don Shula, this legend, stepping down, Jimmy Johnson coming in, you have this legendary quarterback. Just how crazy was all that for you being a young intern at that time?
It was crazy, and it was kind of everything I could have ever imagined and dreamed of and more. I grew up a Dolphins fan. I'm a South Florida kid. I grew up a Dolphins fan. That's part of why I know the things that I know about the history, because I watched so much of it as a kid. And my stepfather and grandfather, they would talk to me about the things that I didn't get to see, the 72 team and so on and so forth. So all I ever really wanted to do was work for the Dolphins. I did an internship with the Cleveland Cavaliers, actually, in the 95 season. So Terrell Brandon, Chris Mills, Tyrone Hill, Bobby Phills, may he rest in peace. We traded for Dan Marley. It was a lot of fun to kind of just get my feet wet in professional sports. But I got the opportunity to go work for my hometown team. My dream was to, if all I had gotten was that internship opportunity, that would have been great. It became so much more. But yeah, man, that was, I start there. Really, Jimmy had just taken over. He had just been named the head coach. I think I got in right around the draft time. And it was Jimmy Johnson being Jimmy Johnson, beloved down here because of his work with the University of Miami. All the swagger, that is an overplayed word now, but he just, it oozed from his pores, right? And just making a name for himself as the Dolphins head coach. And so you had this whole transition of guys who were Shula guys and where would they fit in. And my partner, OJ McDuffie, was drafted by Coach Shula in 93. And, that transition was an interesting one for him. He's not the biggest Jimmy Johnson fan. If you listen to our show, you hear that all the time. But I think he gave a whole lot to Jimmy during his time in terms of his performance on the field, and that's because OJ's just an amazing competitor. But guys that have been on our show, friends of ours, Terry Kirby, getting traded in training camp. Pete Stoyanovich walking off the field, finding out he had been traded to Kansas City, and literally kind of in tears and just completely shocked that was the case, and doing a presser. A few games into the season, Keith Byers gets cut after a game. He's upset that we won a game, but he didn't keep his 140-something game catch streak. And Jimmy didn't want veteran guys. He wanted young, fast, and I hate to use the word obedient, but guys that were going to kind of buy into the system. All our guys talk about how, and this is what's so crazy with the CBA now and the way they practice and play. I think we had 14 two-a-days that training camp, and guys were just beat to shit. Pardon my language. I don't know what your language, you guys handle it here on the show, but guys were just beat down. And I'm a 23-year-old kid, and I'm enamored by being a part of it all and being around it all, and a little intimidated by, like, don't even look at Jimmy the wrong way. And although it was, as a staff member, and he really respected my boss, Harvey Green. So, I think our department was important to him. As long as you did your job, Jimmy was cool with you, and, he'd joke around a little bit. I did not go out of my way to buddy because I do my role, but it was just super cool. And my hero, Dan Marino, was still working for the team, I was playing for the team, excuse me. So I got to be a part of the last 4 years of his career as a Miami Dolphin. So it was just an amazing experience all the way around.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this too earlier, and I was, just kind of putting myself almost in your shoes. Like, man, if I were to ever work for the Eagles or any other of these teams, the Phillies, what would like that experience be like? So I guess what I wanted to ask you was, what was like the first, like, oh my God moment? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you walk in and you see all this one person.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All of it was, because again, this was my dream. This is what I had worked for. And I'll give you a fun little story. You guys, you're historians. You ever see the movie School Ties with Brendan Fraser? And it takes place, I think, in the 40s. There's a young Matt Damon, a young Ben Affleck. And basically the story, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's there's this elite private school. I forget what part of town, but it's like in the 40s or what have you. And football is very important to this school. And they have this annual game against one of the other elite schools, and they don't have a quarterback. So they find this kid who is just an absolute stud from the wrong side of the tracks. And, he plays for a public school, what have you, but he's a Jewish kid. And that is kind of like, there's nobody Jewish in the school. And there's this scene where Brendan Fraser first shows up to the school, and he's excited for this opportunity, but he's a little kind of hesitant. And he takes off his Star of David. He takes off the chain and he puts it. And so when I got the job or the internship, diehard Dolphins fan, like damn near face painted as a high school kid and going to the games and all the things. I've got all the pictures of guys who I have become friends with now, of like when I got their autographs at card shows and all of that stuff. And I had a little gold chain with a little Miami Dolphins, the old logo, remember that was a big thing back. Well, I don't know how old you guys are, but 80s and 90s, your little gold chains. My guys tease me because I wore it outside the shirt, But, and I was like, I don't want to go in there and be perceived as a fan. I want to go in there and be perceived as an employee and a hard worker. And I have historical knowledge because of my fandom, but I'm not going to be a face painter when I walk in this building. And I tell that to young people who want to get involved in the profession now, is you can't go in there and be a face painter, because teams reject that in a lot of ways, because they feel like you're going to maybe be a little compromised or not focus on the right things and on the work. And so I remember taking off that chain and putting it in my drawer, and I was like, this is never going to see the light of day again. And eventually, all my wardrobe is Dolphin stuff now and everything else. And now I'm in this cool place where I can kind of be a fan, but be a professional and learn to balance all that. But that in and of itself was like, this is friggin' awesome. Like, oh, damn. Good morning, Dan Marino. Good morning.
Yeah.
And even OJ. So OJ, I always tell the story. He was the first veteran that talked to me. The young guys, we were all the same age. I was 23 years old. So were guys like, I don't know, our 5th round draft pick that year was Zach Thomas. You know what I mean? So I got to know the young guys. Right. But who knew at that point in time that this 5'10", 5'11" linebacker from Texas Tech, who knows what his 40 time is, and you could barely slide a sheet of paper underneath his feet for his vertical, that he was going to become one of the greatest linebackers in the history of football. So that was cool to get to know those guys. But it was like, how do you get the vets to respect you, And I had, as I told you, I was in Cleveland for my internship the year before. I hung out at a Jewish community center playing basketball, and there was a kid there that used to play in the gym. And when I said, "Hey, I'm leaving, guys. I've got this internship with the Dolphins," he's like, "Oh, when you get down there, tell my boy OJ McDuffie." I said, "What's up?" And I was like, "Okay." We were in Cleveland. Everybody thinks they know OJ because OJ's from Cleveland. But we got there, and there he was, and he's so personable, and it's funny now. We've done a podcast together for 5 years. Imagine the two of you guys thinking back to your origin story, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I went up and I was like, "Hey," I was just with the Cavs. I was like, "Oh, hometown, love Cleveland." I said, "Listen, do you know a guy named Rob Brown?" He's like, "Snoopy, that's my." And instantly, I had credibility with
Right.
a guy who, now OJ was only in his third year, but he was a respected, actually his fourth year, but he was a respected vet and a leader on the team. And then, if you're cool with this guy, then the next guy respects you. And then obviously your work has to live up to that. And you just kind of become a part of it, man. And it's a really neat deal. It was a lifetime achievement for me. And I turned it into 5 years of podcast stories. So it's been pretty cool.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I know you lived it, and I know Jose and I remember, when Jimmy leaves the Cowboys after that 93 season, early 94,
Yeah.
he's the hottest coach. And, people talk about he was going to Tampa. People talk about him coming to Philly.
Yeah.
And so when he goes to Miami, it like rocked the sports world because it's, Dan Marino looking for that ring.
Yep.
Jimmy Johnson has 2 rings, so it's going to work. And a lot of times, we weren't in Miami, but the stories we heard were Jimmy and Dan couldn't see eye to eye. Would you say like the reason why those 4 years, which I think were a success, but it wasn't Super Bowl successful?
Yeah.
Do you think that was like, can you sum it up to that, or was there a lot more to it?
You can't ever, in a sport like this, you can't ever sum up anything into one thing, right? Dan still could win ball games, but he was, he played 17 seasons, and he was on the tail end of his career. Jimmy really bolstered the defense for that team. Again, Zach Thomas gets drafted in 96, 97, Jason Taylor, Sam Madison, Pat Surtain the next year. Plus all of these other pieces. Tim Bowens, Jimmy was smart enough to know that if I'm going to have a guy like Zach Thomas, I need to have 2 strong defensive tackles, right, to play the style of defense we want to play. Tim Bowens is one of the all-time greats that doesn't get anywhere near enough respect, although he's just being inducted into the Dolphins Ring of Honor this year, which is super cool. And they drafted Daryl Gardner, and Daryl, there's a lot of crazy stories with Daryl as well. Shorty, we used to call him. Shorty was a different cat. But
I've heard those stories on your show, yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Oh my God. Well, when he was balling though, him and Tim down there, and they would take on the 3 guys in the interior line, the center and the 2 guards, had no shot, and that allowed Zach to run around and be elite on his end. And they're playing that wide 9, and you got JT and Trace Armstrong, and then they started getting other younger, fast guys, and they were just relentless on defense. The problem was a team that was the opposite under Coach Shula towards the end, that could score a bunch of points but couldn't stop, a nosebleed, so to speak, under Tom Olivadotti and those late years. They certainly couldn't stop the Buffalo Bills. Again, Buffalo Bills had great teams and Hall of Fame players on offense, but that it was like, okay, we finally got the defense that we want here in Miami, and now we're not paying enough attention to the offense, right? We're not establishing a running game. And Jimmy, in a lot of ways, kind of wanted to take the ball out of Danny's hands. And I think he knew he believed in the value of having a quarterback. Jimmy was smart enough to understand that it still was a quarterback driven league, but Dan had played in the same system for 17 years. Gary Stevens was still the offensive coordinator. We were running a lot of those same plays, and Dan would want to check to things and make calls. And some of these younger receivers that weren't OJ McDuffie couldn't necessarily make the adjustments fast enough, or they didn't know the playbook as well, or they didn't know that Dan referred back to a play that he hadn't called in 6 years, but it was in there. It was all in the Rolodex, right? And so Jimmy tried to really turn it into this check with me system and simplify the offense. And so that did create some challenges there. And, Jimmy, if you look at his history, and you said 2 rings, it's 3 rings, right? Because he was at University of Miami, won a championship there, and turned the Hurricanes into, what the Hurricanes became. And he was able to go there and kind of step on the legacy of Howard Schnellenberger, if you think about it. Then he goes to Dallas and did this. And it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to make you forget about this person. Jimmy was brash. Jimmy was like, and caring about the past was not important to him. And I think he brought some of that same energy. And let me pause for a second. I loved Jimmy Johnson. I loved the whole experience working under him. I felt like it, I was part of the team during my 4 years with coach there. But you can't, I've got eyes, and I understand that some of those things really rubbed people the wrong way. It rubbed alumni. It rubbed guys that had come over from Coach Shula, the wrong way at times. And then what really happened is he was critical very early on of Dan in a game after a game, and fans lost their flipping minds. And I think he realized, wow, my whole career I've been able to do this, but I really can't step on the legacy of Don Shula or, the aura of Dan Marino. And that may have created a little bit of a rift. I think they worked through it. When Jimmy tried to step down after the 98 season, Dan was the first guy to show up and say, Coach, like, I don't have a whole lot of years left in me. I can't rebuild. He literally met Jimmy when Jimmy showed up the next day, ready to retire. And he had gone through a lot of things, the loss of his mother, so on and so forth. And we had suffered some we would advance in the playoffs and then eventually just get our ass kicked and get worn out. And Dan showed up and he's like, we got to do this together or, it's not going to work out for either of us. And Jimmy gave it one more year, but that he probably shouldn't have. I think like anything in life, guys, if somebody's trying to convince you of something that they want more than you do, it's never going to work. He brought in Dave Wannstedt and it was clear that Dave was the assistant head coach, but it was, the heir apparent, and he was getting ready to hand the thing over to him. It just it didn't end the way we all had hoped that it would. But we won a lot of games. We went to the playoffs every year other than his first year. We went 8-8 his first year in 96. And then we went to the playoffs 97, 98, 99 after he left, 2000, 2001. And then with Dave, which is crazy because Ricky came in, but things started to fall off and go the other direction.
Yeah, I know looking from the outside, and again, I wasn't a big Dolphins fan, but I did love Jimmy Johnson, and I just love watching good teams play. It doesn't matter what teams they are, and I was just thinking, I remember back then, like, man, if he had a few more years, because you talked about some of the players on defense that, he drafted,
studs, man.
Right, and that defensive side was set, you know what I mean? And you talked about it too, and it was just he missed on a couple running backs there, a couple wide receivers, and it's just like, man, like, a couple years later, they bring Ricky, and then maybe who else knows what can happen later on. And I felt like they were really close, and especially at that time where the AFC wasn't as strong. Like, yeah, you had Denver was a powerhouse, you had New England coming up, but a lot of these other teams, they weren't really, really strong. The Bills were fading at this point. Like, a lot of these teams that were good, Kansas City was just a decent team. Like, this was their shot, you know what I mean? Like, and I felt like they missed that window, man. And I was like, man, if Jimmy could have hit on a couple of those guys, I think Miami would have been perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be the argument, right? If the offense was better, and again, you have to. Dan still had it. There was some great comebacks even in that last year, and he had injuries, but there were still some unbelievable moments. We had an unbelievable comeback against the Colts, and then actually the 99, the last season before Jacksonville just humiliated us 62-7. The week before, we shut down the Kingdom. We flew all the way out to Seattle. It was the last game ever played in the Kingdom. Like, you literally could see wires and stuff. They were setting that place up to be demolished, and they blew it up. I don't know if it was the next day or that week after we left. They friggin' blew the place up. And Dan had a great comeback in that game as well. So he still had that. But to ask him to carry the load and not have enough pieces around him, and that's no disrespect to the guys who were there on offense, including my co-host, but he'll be the first one to tell you, like, we just didn't get it done on offense. We couldn't, we had Richmond Webb still, we had Tim Ruddy, but then we were trying to fill in some younger linemen and couldn't get those guys going. We did draft Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in 96, and he was, there was a lot of good, not great. But I also think that they probably weren't creative enough with their offensive play calling. And Gary Stevens, that wore itself thin. Gary kind of, Gary's a rough and gruff guy, and he had rubbed, I think, some coaches and some players the wrong way. And so, he was dismissed, and Kippy Brown was elevated, and they just never could get that offense rolling again.
No, it's interesting because I think it's crazy that it took Jimmy way too long to get into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And
Yeah.
I would hear, I don't think it was the majority of people, but I don't know where people were using his Dolphins tenure like against him.
It's so
And I
silly.
thought that was just the dumbest thing. And certain even
Yeah.
like national pundit, and I'm like, how can you use that? He had a winning record. He was successful there,
Right. He
but
didn't
he
win a Super
changed
Bowl
football.
there. Yeah, you're exactly right. It is ridiculous, and some of that. I mean, there's probably a number of different things. The Hall of Fame is a whole other conversation, and it was eye opening to me to see some of the inner workings just when JT went through. When we went through the process of him being eligible and being elected in his first year, it was really cool to kind of learn about it. Being a fan of the Hall of Fame and kind of having my opinions of who should be in the Hall of Fame for years, but then kind of seeing the process. But Jimmy was beloved by some media. He kind of had that villain mentality in a lot of other ways. And sometimes, I don't know what it is. Sometimes I think greatness in one way kind of almost is held against people in another way. Like, yeah, Jimmy won Super Bowls with great players, but he drafted all those Hall of Famers. Like he had the courage to trade away Herschel Walker and make that big trade. And he drafted Troy Aikman that year in the first round, but then also drafted Steve Walsh, if you remember, from the University of Miami in the supplemental draft. And then, he's like, all right, I got these two guys. We're going to see who's the real, and cut a guy that was a UM guy and went for this other kid and believed in him. And, so clearly a Hall of Fame career that's been recognized. And, it's cool that he's been a part of it. But he would never go. He never went to Canton. He would never, it wasn't Jimmy's personality back then when all those guys from Dallas were going in. But JT had him as his presenter when he went in, and Jimmy said yes. And then when he showed up to Canton, I know JT said they do so many magical things, but they have this luncheon. I think it's the Merlin Olsen luncheon, but they have this
Ray
luncheon
Nitschke luncheon, I think.
There's a couple different ones, but they bring all the guys together without the public. And JT said all the Michael Irvin, Emmitt Smith, all those guys came up and they were like, man, thank you so much for getting Jimmy out here, And so he presented JT, he gets elected himself, then he presented Zach. And I feel like now he's a part of it now.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Cool. I wanted to, because you also, helped make a documentary, Fish Tank Iconic, the comeback, about Dan Marino's epic return from injury. Anyone can go watch that on YouTube. It's really good, really awesome.
Real
Did
good.
you watch it? You guys watched it? Awesome.
We're huge fans of documentaries also. Like we've done a bunch of shows on different documentaries and kind of like gave our 2 cents on them. But that was a great one. Yeah. Thank you for sending that over.
Yeah, it was a passion project, and it took a long time to get it done, and just to get people to kind of see the validity in it. But we're pretty proud of it. Obviously OJ and I, and then one of my childhood buddies, Chris Clark, who did the editing, and really we kind of co-wrote it, directed, edited. He did the editing, but he had me looking over his shoulder, which he probably didn't like. And funny story, Chris and I grew up together. He's a huge 49ers fan, South Florida 49ers fan, which, come on, man. But but he's a Joe Montana guy. And so we grew up like that was from the time we were in elementary school. We grew up arguing Marino versus Montana, right? And he got all the rings, and I get it. And we had all the records on our side, and we would argue that all the time. And then, I think it was about a year ago, Montana came out and said the greatest of all time was Dan Marino. And I called him up and I'm like, I won, brother. Your guy picked my guy. I won. But it was cool to work on this with him as a friend, but it was also cool for him to have to spend that much time digesting Marino's greatness.
No, well, I was curious, because knowing so much of Dolphins history and knowing so much about Dan Marino's history, what led you to pick that particular
game? Yeah. So I pitched this idea to, pull the curtain back a little bit. We started the Fish Tank independently. OJ and I did. Well, when I say independently, actually, there's a 5 Reasons Sports is a South Florida-based podcast network. It was started by a guy named Ethan Skolnick. Ethan was a beat writer who covered the Dolphins for years. when I was with the team. And then he moved on to covering the Heat during the whole Big Three era, and that kind of rose to prominence. And then he kind of stepped away from a lot of that for different reasons. And I was checking in on him one day, and I'm like, "Hey man, what are you up to?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm starting this podcast network." And I didn't know shit about podcasts. I'm like, "What?" I got people telling me about podcasts. I got enough content, and friggin' Netflix and this and that. I can't handle anything else. And he started telling me what he was doing, and he was bringing on a lot of folks like yourself, a lot of fan content creators, people that were doing some great stuff. And then some people that I didn't think were doing great stuff, but they were passionate, and he was bringing them on. And I kind of joked about, hey, is there room for an old washed up PR guy who happens to work for one of the South Florida sports icons? And he goes, man, you probably have more stories than anybody. And so the Fish Tank was born. OJ and I started it with them. We left 5 Reasons. And really didn't want to be a part of the organization because we didn't want what we felt was going to be kind of antiseptic. Like we wanted to tell our stories the way we wanted to tell them, and we didn't want to be controlled. But Jason Jenkins, who was at the time, he was the head of communications and their community work and everything. He's just a real visionary. And he called me one day, and I thought I was in trouble. I'm like, what the hell did I do? And he said, no, I love your show, and I want it to be a part of our work. And so he brought us on board with a guy by the name of Travis Wingfield, who came from the Locked On world. He was Locked On Dolphins, and Travis is brilliant. I think he does the best Dolphins podcast out there. And he created this network. And so we were just excited. We were excited to be back with the team again. And he also gave us the freedom to be ourselves. We had to adjust a little bit, understanding that we're collecting a check from the team, but he gave us the freedom to be ourselves. And Jason reached out to me, I want to say going into our 3rd year. And he's like, we're going to kill it this year. You're going to get Tua. You're going to get the head coach. We're going to do this. But I want to think about years 4, 5, 6, 7, like how do you evolve? And we pitched a couple different ideas, and one of them was this Fish Tank Iconic, and he absolutely loved it. Not to turn the story tragic, but like 2 months later, Jason passed away. He was a 47-year-old guy. He was just the heart and soul of that team in so many ways, and it was devastating. Father of 3, and he continues to get recognized. Our organization, Jason Taylor Foundation, recognized him this past May because of all the great work that he did. But it was like, okay, now we pitched this idea, and our champion is not here anymore to support it. Thankfully, Ann Nolan, who is the VP of Communications for the Dolphins now, she saw validity in the project, and so she gave me the green light to go for it. I don't think any of us imagined it was going to become what it was going to become, but I was like, all right, if I'm going to call this Fish Tank Iconic, sorry, it took me 6 minutes to get to answer your question. If I'm going to call it Fish Tank Iconic, I want to pick iconic games, but I don't want to go to the easy, low-hanging fruit.
Right.
This is going to sound wrong. I don't want to go to the 85 Bears game because it's been discussed so much in Dolphins lore. I think it's awesome that you guys discussed it. And at some point, I think we would want to do it. But I just feel like that one, everybody would guess, oh, you're going to do the 85 Bears game. You'll do the Super Bowl 7. You'll do the clock play, right? And I was like, no, there are other iconic moments that I think these stories need to be told. And I feel that may have been Danny's best game that he ever played. It wasn't necessarily the most important in the context of a football season because it was week 1. And we all know that week 1 doesn't determine a whole season. And he had playoff wins and so on and so forth. And that 85 Bears game probably was more significant in some ways. But Superman had fallen from the sky the year before, man. Like Dan Marino was the one constant. And certainly in Miami, but he was a league-wide constant. And now all of a sudden, could he ever even play again? And then for him to show up and throw for 5 touchdowns, 473 yards, while Bledsoe throws for 4 touchdowns and 420 yards. And in that, just all of the things that are discussed in the documentary. And of course, the 4th and 5 play, which is just, how many guys could even make that decision to just forget what was sent in from the sidelines? We're going for everything right now. And then to throw that ball. So I just felt that it truly was an iconic moment and it was the right story to tell. And I didn't choose it for this reason, but it didn't hurt that this year marked the 30-year anniversary of that game. So it just kind of the stars were aligned, and we had to hustle to get the darn thing done in time for the 30th anniversary. But we're really proud of what we rolled out, and for fans to watch, for the story to be preserved, and not just, oh, it was a 4th and 5 and dance, all the things I said. There were so many layers to it, as you guys saw. So for us to be able to talk to Irving Fryer, who caught 3 touchdowns in that game, to talk to Drew Bledsoe, for Drew Bledsoe to tell us, he stood on the sideline and was like, look, as a quarterback, like, I'm a competitor, I want to win that game, but as a quarterback, I was like, that was a pretty cool throw by Dan. Like that, he said those was a big set of balls to make that throw. That's really cool to hear that stuff. Jim Lampley, who called so many great NFL games, for him to come on that show and tell us that it was the greatest professional game that he ever called. It was just a lot of neat voices there, and now it's there. It's on YouTube. We want to get more eyes on it, but it's a story that's preserved. And the next group of guys that are trying to be bigger than the game and go back and watch, they can not only watch the game like you guys did 85 Bears, but they can get research from that documentary. So that's the goal.
No, it was great. It was great. And we messaged you about this privately, but we were going to do that game. It was either that game or the 85 Bears game.
Yeah.
And, we were like, let's just do the 85 Bears. And
I love it.
It was a great game. But that team, watching the documentary and just remembering that team. And I remember I was rooting for that team. Not only one, because I wanted Marino to come back and, play well and things like that from that injury. But that team had so many former Eagles on that team. Like, they had Keith Byars, Keith Jackson, Ron Eller. They had a Doug Peterson later on. And, we get a couple guys from that team, and Irving Fryer and Troy Vincent. Like, that team had a lot of connections to me as a fan, for an Eagles fan. And not to bring the Eagles into this, but I was just like, I wanted those guys to do well, because here at that time with the Keith Byars and the Keith Jacksons, like, the way the Eagles, that organization was run at that time with Buddy and all that, it was different. You know what I mean? Like, and I was happy for those guys to go somewhere where they're going to be able to be successful, and you're going to be able to see Keith Jackson, like, doing so many tremendous things, and Keith Byars doing his thing. So I was definitely rooting for that team.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, I told you guys my dad's a big Eagles fan, and I think he, a lot of those same reasons, he liked that. And then obviously because I was a Dolphins fan, he was supportive. And then Irving Fryer goes to the Eagles after, 2 years later, he's going for and has 4 touchdown catches against us. It was one of my first road trips as an intern. And I was like, dang, Irv, you didn't have to do that to us. But, man.
Yeah, good seasons here. Yeah. He played well here.
He did.
What he did in the latter part of his career is, I don't know that it's probably unprecedented. Nuts. If you go look at his career statistics and the Pro Bowls that he made, and how they were all kind of when someone's career is supposed to be going downward. But he had a lot of trials and tribulations personally early on, and New England wasn't necessarily structured, even though they drafted him as the number 1 overall pick. And he talked about it on the show, actually. But, they had a couple years. That 85 year was one of them. But they just they didn't have that high flying offense that could have benefited from someone with his skill set.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because, that 93 team, the year that Dan got hurt, I always kind of wonder, because we did an episode a couple years ago, you check our archives on it, on that Leon Lett game, that Thanksgiving game. And, Marino's hurt for that game.
Yes,
but with that win on Thanksgiving, they go 9-2 and wind up losing the rest of the games that year to go 9-7. And like Jose said, they felt like they were trying to get tougher. They brought in all, you see, I think Mike Golick was on that team, and all the names that, like Jose mentioned. And I'm kind of like, if Marino stayed healthy, was that the year that they could have beaten Buffalo and gone to the Super Bowl?
A lot of people feel it was. They never won another game that year, and Dallas never lost another game that year.
Yeah.
Dallas went on to win the Super Bowl. So pretty crazy stuff. We just, we've had people talk about it recently, even on the show, and that was that Dallas game was amazing. That was, and Keith Byars tells the story about the Snow Angels, and Richmond tells, just there's so many guys that have great stories about that game. But that was the end of fun times that season. That's for sure.
No, absolutely. And so, just wondering, is there any other like projects that you're thinking about? Like, what would be that next like documentary you'd want to work on then. Like,
yeah. So we're waiting to see what happens if we can get greenlit for another one. The next story that I want to tell, again, that kind of mindset of talking about things that I think are really important stories but don't always get discussed, is 2001. The Dolphins faced the Raiders in the first game back post 9/11 tragedies. If you guys remember, September 11th, 2001 took place on a Tuesday. The NFL and all major sports suspended play after that for a period of time. So there were no games the weekend after that for obvious reasons. But then the following week, they came back and played, and the Dolphins played the Raiders. And Jay Fiedler was the quarterback at this point in time. He's a Jewish kid from New York, and he had ties to people who were in those towers. And, they have this epic come from behind victory with Jay diving across the goal line to score the winning touchdown. And he kind of lifts his fist, and that ends up, there's a Sports Illustrated cover. If you go look it up, that's the cover of Sports Illustrated. And it's kind of like sports are back, or football is back. And he became the cover boy for, the world of sports bouncing back post 9/11. And so there's a lot of really cool elements to that story as well. That would be the next one.
I do remember that cover, and I'm already excited for that, because I really haven't really thought about that, because everyone goes, to New York and, the baseball World Series and things like that. And, we do forget about that. The NFL was also, everything was paused, obviously, but the NFL had to come back and had a lot of great memories and things like that at that time.
And that's the first weekend back, right? So that is the first, that weekend was kind of the first weekend that any sports were being played. Yep. And that also the pageantry that existed prior, not just for the Dolphins, but league wide, that, every player stood on the sidelines with an American flag. They had the flyovers. They came out and sang the national anthem. And I had kind of forgotten this, but OJ McDuffie reminds me, man, we used to be in the locker room during the national anthem. That was, we didn't really start having both teams come out for the anthem and all of that pageantry until 9/11. And I was like, man, I didn't even think about that or realize that. But a lot of what we see now with the flyovers, the giant flags on the field, a lot of that was born there when the country came together, post these horrific attacks.
No, absolutely. That's true. And just thinking, though, if there's one, and you could go to any era, but who's that player for you in Dolphins history who you're like, man, I know you mentioned like how great Tim Bowens was, but like, who's that player who you're like, the public don't talk about him enough, like how great he really was?
Man, that is a great question. I mean, I think Timbo might be that guy. Timbo was a dude, and he was so respected by his teammates, respected and feared. There is probably for a 10 or more year period, you ask anybody who's the one guy you wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of in a dark alley or in a barroom brawl, and they're like, Timbo. Like he, that whole country strong that you hear about, and Tim's whole career, he went to community college. I think he played 9 games, maybe even less, of NCAA football. And then he's the number 1 overall pick, or not overall pick, but the Dolphins' first round draft pick. Mean Joe Green goes to his Okolona, Mississippi, goes to the small town in Mississippi. And Timbo, if you want to go listen, here I am just plugging, self-promoting here. But
no, it's great.
Timbo was a great guest on our show. And if you don't know Timbo, he very rarely did any media. Very rarely did media. And but he came on our show, and it's actually some of our shows are on YouTube, and the Tim Bowens episode. I would always say, if you really are into what we do, listen to the podcast, because that's where you're going to get it in its entirety. The stuff on YouTube is kind of pared down, but it's a fun episode because he's sitting there in his black T-shirt, and he's got a hat pulled down, and he's got his dark sunglasses on, and he's sitting in the studio, and he's just a grown-ass man. And he talks about when he was in this small little town. He had barely played any college football, but he knew he could play. And Mean Joe Green shows up in his hometown, and they meet at this bar. And Timbo goes into the back room and clears it out. Like, there's some bums there and some guys shooting pool. And he's like, get the heck, like, he didn't want to embarrass himself in his town when Mean Joe Green was going to sit there, and he didn't want to blow his big opportunity. And he just showed up. So I think they tried to do some hazing, and he damn near killed some veterans as a result, and left. He's like, I'm done. And they got him to come back in, and he had this amazing career. It was a Pro Bowl career. Probably should have been to more Pro Bowls. He's a completely selfless dude. If he was sitting here right now, he'd be upset with me talking about him like this. But he's a completely selfless dude. But go talk to anybody who's ever played with him, and they talk about how great he was. Mark Dixon used to say he doesn't have a reverse in his gearbox. You cannot make Tim Bowens go backwards, and he would just, he was great. Here's a great, I think we tell this on the fish tank, but here's another great story with Tim Bowens, just to give you an idea about how strong this dude was. He never would go into the gym, in the weight room. He would never go in. And they would, make him come in, and he would just do the bare minimum that was required if they forced him to come in. He'd always come. We would say he'd come in with his Timberlands on and untied, and he'd be like, nah, man. But he would show up, and he would just sit down there and never had a spot, take the bar off the rack and rep out, whatever. So they would do these testing days, would just see who was the strongest guy, and they would try and set records. And all the gym rats are really into that. And Daryl Gardner probably cared about the weight room more than what happened on the field. He was just a workout fiend. And Shorty went in. He had done, I don't know what it was. Let's say it was 15 reps of 315 or something. Whatever that was the record for that day. And Tim came in like, Tim, you got to test. John Gamble was the strength coach, and who's a former strongman himself. You can go back and watch the old ESPN where they're carrying the beer kegs and all that. And he's like, Tim, you got to come in. So Tim goes in, and he's like, what's the high? And they're like, and my numbers might be inaccurate. So, but essentially he's like, Shorty got 15. And he's like, all right. So he lays down, no warm up, none of that, just wearing his white tee. And no, I don't need no spot. 315, grabs it off the bar himself, reps it out to 14 and puts it back on. Boom. Or 15. I think he got to like 1 or 2 before what Daryl, but like had, boom, 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 repped it out, never struggled, and then re-racked it and got up. And they were like, and Coach Gamble's like, Tim, what you had more, like what and basically he was like, let that man that's important to him. He needs to have that record. I know I can crush that record. I'm gonna go back. If y'all need me, I'll be sitting in my corner of the locker room. Like Timbo was just that dude. And every team would benefit from having that kind of a cog in the line. And also the other thing he did was when he was first drafted, he was more of a playmaking back. He had a game against his rookie year where he was defensive rookie of the year. He had a game against the Jets where he had 2 or 3 sacks, I think, against Boomer Esiason, and just was one of those, the stuff you see now from guys that kind of swim the offensive linemen and become pass rushers and make plays behind the line of scrimmage. But Jimmy changed the style of play, and Dave carried it on. And his responsibility was to take on 2 and 3 guys so that, your playmakers could go in and make plays. And he did it, and he never barked, he never complained, and he just showed up and he did his job, and he had his teammates back, and he was just a bad, bad man.
Yeah, that's a name I haven't thought of in a while. But I remember him being
Go watch
stud.
tape, man.
Yeah.
Go watch tape with Tim Bowens, and you'll be like, oh, wow, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, that Miami defense was really good, and he was definitely a huge part of that.
But that's what's great, though. Sorry to interrupt, Jose. Saying that's what's cool to hear, because I would have thought you would have said, someone like Richmond Webb, who should be in the Hall of Fame, Sam Madison or Surtain or someone like that.
All great. All great players and all great guys that I got to work. I mean, all really wonderful players. And Richmond absolutely should have been a Hall of Fame. I don't understand that one. We're still talking about it now, and there's some momentum going, and there's a group of fans, even one all the way out in France, that's really pushing for Richmond. And he is the nicest human being you will ever meet, Big Rich, man. He's such a great dude and a great sense of humor. Both of those guys have a hilarious sense of humor. But and Richmond was brought in to square off against Bruce Smith, and he held his own and sometimes gave Bruce the business. So, and Bruce is, greatest pass rusher who ever lived, right? But he and Reggie White, we'll throw Reggie White in there too.
I was going to say, he may be second. But,
number two.
So godly, man, Reggie White was the minister, man. He was a real deal too. But 2 of the best of all time, right? You can certainly say that. And Richmond could play against those dudes, and he was so athletically gifted. And it's a real shame those guys, there's him, Mark Clayton, there's a number of guys that because Dan was so great, that the greatness of those other players gets overlooked, I think. And almost Dan's greatness gets held against him. I asked Dan about that when he was on the show, and he said, well, it shouldn't be held. Like, I shouldn't be held against these guys. So, that was something that he's a guy. Another guy, now he's got a gold jacket, so it's really weird to say underrated. And I messaged you guys about this when we were, talking, is Dwight Stevenson. His career was cut short. Dwight, anybody who played in Miami would tell you he's the greatest center of all time. He's certainly got to be a top 3, top 5 center of all time. That game that you guys watched, if you go back and watch it again, he had a significant shoulder injury in the first half, and he basically whooped William Perry the entire second half with one arm. And he played the entire game with one arm in the second half. I'm sorry, the entire second half. So there's a lot of greats. Obviously, I'm biased, but if you're talking about Dolphins history, those are some guys that stand out to me.
Yeah, Deremy's the offensive line guy. I was looking at Surtain and Madison when I was growing up, and I love DBs and running backs, and those guys were so great together. Yeah,
studs. They were. Sam Madison for about a 3-year period was every bit as what you hear about with Revis Island or Jalen Ramsey. Yeah. Like, he was as locked down. People would not even throw his way. And then all of a sudden you get Pat on the other side, and it's like, what can we do with these guys? And they would talk so much shit, and they would, they would dance. If you come to a home game in Miami in between timeouts, they'd start playing Trick Daddy and all this, Miami music. And our guys they're like in the club and they're dancing or whatever. And Peyton Manning used to say, I don't know how they do it. And then they would just lock people down. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
Definitely. It was fun for a non-Miami fan to watch that. So
I couldn't imagine
I love good defenses, man. Like, I'm definitely old school when it comes to that. And they had that. So I wanted to ask you, Seth, there's something that me and Deremy talk about all the time on our podcast. And it's like, it doesn't even have to be specific to Miami Dolphins, but we always go back and we revisit boxing. We've done like Ali Frazier, like we've done a lot of that stuff. Yeah. And it's like big sporting events, right? Like that. If we can go back in time to, like, man, I would 100% be at this time. Like, what is the sporting event that you would want to go back to?
Wow, that's such a great question. You might have hit. I'm a huge Muhammad Ali fan. I've read 3 books on Ali, and I'm a huge Ali fan. And I think I've never been to one, but there's supposedly nothing like a big time heavyweight title fight. I don't know which one, right? It's funny now. My wife is from the Philippines, so you got the Thrilla in Manila is one of the all-time greats, although it was supposed to be epically hot at that one. But that's a great one. Ali Frazier, the first one, even though he lost that one, was incredible, right? Just him coming off of being essentially, right, he a draft dodger and all of those things, and had his title stripped. And Joe Frazier was just young and mean and was had been berated by Ali in so many ways, and and kind of what's crazy what's crazy about all that one. And I apologize, I'm looking at the time and realize I have to jump to a meeting. But when you do the research there, Ali really made Frazier out to be almost, they used the term Uncle Tom, and he was basically turning the black community against Joe Frazier in that fight. And that hurt Frazier to his core, because he was more, Ali was the pretty dude, and Ali had kind of, come from a different type of environment, and, I think a good family and all these things. And Frazier was like, man, I more identify with the plight of people of color right now. How are you? Like me? So, I mean, you had all of those things that were going on in the country that kind of permeated into that fight. My stepdad, I remember him telling me he cried when Ali got knocked down, when Frazier caught him with that one. And, so I mean, a lot. Yeah. Any one of those fights, those big time Ali fights, either one of the fights with Frazier, the Foreman fight, I think just to see him in his prime, the first one where he beat Sonny Liston, where I shook up the world, like that fight in and of itself would be, imagine if you were there when nobody in the world thought that Ali had a chance against the big bad bear, and he pulled it off. So I think that, I didn't give you a direct answer, But
you're good.
Pick any one of those Ali fights. If I had an opportunity to be there for that, I mean, golly, what a gift.
Yeah, one of our October episodes will be Ali Foreman. We're going to rewatch that and break that down. So we're big boxing fans. We're big Ali Frazier fans. Just
yeah, man.
Any boxing fan. Yeah, like we're big time with that.
And we did the first back in
Yep.
February. It was 60 years. The first, he was Clay then, but the first
Right.
Ali Liston fight, which was in Miami, I believe.
Yep, he trained at the Fifth Street Gym. So I'll have to check that one out, man. And all the Sonny Liston stuff, and his ties to the mob, and he's an interesting, sad story in and of himself. So, that would all be really cool.
No, but Seth, we just appreciate you spending time with us, and love to have you back on anytime to talk anything. Like, it's been so fun.
Man. Awesome. Well, thank you. And like I said, my dad will be proud I'm hanging out with a couple Philly guys. So,
absolutely.
It'll all be good. You guys are doing great work. Keep it up. And thank you for tagging me and kind of bringing me into your world. I'll check out some of these old episodes and would love to come back.
No, absolutely. No, thank you. And people, please check out. It's an awesome podcast. Seth, OJ McDuffie, The Fish Tank, wherever you can listen to podcasts. Like he said, they're on YouTube as well, but you're going to get great stories like what Seth gave us today. So please check that out. And is there anything else you want to talk, anything else plug-in you want to give?
That's man. That's it. I'm going to put on my foundation hat. I'm getting to work with the Jason Taylor Foundation next. We've got some events, our after-school reading program, and some things that we're doing there. Yeah. So I wear two different hats. I got to take my podcasting hat off and put on my foundation director hat.
Awesome. So now thank you so much. And for our amazing guest, Seth Levit, for the hardest working man in show business, Mr. Jose Ruiz.
I love it, Jose. Grind, baby, grind.
I'm Deremy Duff. Thank you guys for listening to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. Take care.
Peace.